An empire was collapsing, a pope was rising, and Europe was on the brink of explosion. The Crusades didn't begin for a single reason. They began when everything collided at once. In the East, the Byzantine Empire was weakening. In the West, the Church was gaining power while society sank into chaos. Then, in 1095, one man stepped forward, Pope Urban II. He called for war, but unleashed something far greater. And when he finished, the crowd cried, Deus Vult, God wills it. But was that really the reason? Stay with me for the next 8 minutes to uncover what truly started the First Crusade. The Byzantine Empire didn't collapse in a single battle. It was already dying long before anyone noticed. And the most shocking part? Its fall didn't begin with the Crusades. It began centuries earlier. By the late 11th century, Byzantium had lost Anatolia, the very heart of its empire. But this wasn't just land. It was where their armies were born and where their power came from. After the disaster at Manzikert in 1071, everything unraveled fast. Seljuk forces didn't just defeat Byzantium, they flooded into its core like a broken dam. Suddenly, Constantinople was no longer protected. For the first time in centuries, the capital stood exposed. But the empire wasn't just losing in the east. From the west, Norman armies were advancing. From the north, nomadic raiders were pressing in. And inside the empire, it was already breaking itself apart. But here's what most people miss. Byzantium wasn't always weak. 600 years earlier, it ruled one of the most powerful empires on earth. It controlled Syria, Egypt, even Jerusalem. So what changed? A new force emerged from the desert. And within a single century, everything Byzantium had built began to disappear. Syria fell, then Jerusalem, then Egypt, its richest province. Yet the empire didn't collapse. For 400 years, it fought, adapted, and survived, holding onto Anatolia as its final stronghold. And for a moment, it seemed like enough. Until a new enemy arrived. The Seljuk Turks didn't just attack the borders. They shattered the system that had kept Byzantium alive for centuries. By 1095, this was no longer an empire of power. It was an empire running out of time. And soon, it would be forced to make a desperate decision that would change history forever. In the late 11th century, the Catholic Church was not united. There were rival popes, political interference, and constant conflict with kings and emperors. At the center of it all was a struggle for control. Who had the right to appoint bishops, the Pope or the Emperor? This wasn't just theology. It was a battle for power over all of Europe. At one point, there were even two popes at the same time, one in Rome and one backed by the Holy Roman Emperor. The church was fractured, its authority questioned, and then Urban II rose to power. But here's the catch. He didn't inherit a stable church. He inherited a battlefield. Urban II had to prove something no pope had fully achieved before, that his authority stood above kings. But how do you unite a divided Europe? You give it a common enemy. When the Byzantine emperor asked for help against the Seljuk Turks, Urban saw more than a request. He saw an opportunity. By framing the war as a holy mission, he could turn scattered knights into a unified force. By promising forgiveness of sins, he could mobilize thousands. And more importantly, he could position himself as the leader of all Christendom. The crusade wasn't just about Jerusalem. It was about power. The Pope didn't call for the crusade from a position of absolute power. He called it while the church itself was divided. And that's what makes this moment so dangerous. With one call at Clermont in 1095, Urban II did what no ruler had done before. He moved an entire continent, and in doing so, he transformed the papacy from a religious authority into a force that could shape the fate of Europe. Jerusalem was never just a city. It was the heart of belief itself, and whoever controlled it held something far greater than land. Before the First Crusade, Jerusalem stood at the center of three worlds. For Christians, it was where Jesus was crucified and resurrected. For Muslims, it was the site of Al-Aqsa, the prophet's journey to heaven. For Jews, it was the memory of the temple and the core of their identity. This wasn't just geography. This was faith, history, and destiny, all in one place. And that's what made it so powerful, because controlling Jerusalem didn't just mean ruling a city. It meant claiming spiritual legitimacy. But there was another layer most people overlook. Jerusalem sat at the crossroads of continents, between Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. Trade routes passed through it. Pilgrims traveled across it. Armies moved because of it. Whoever held Jerusalem controlled movement, influence, and connection between worlds. So when tensions rose in the 11th century, this city became more than symbolic. It became a trigger. And this is where everything changes. When Pope Urban II called for the crusade, he didn't just talk about strategy or politics. He spoke about Jerusalem because he understood something crucial. People don't march for borders, they march for belief. By framing the war as a mission to reclaim the Holy Land, he turned faith into fuel. He reached into something deeper than fear, into devotion, honor, and identity. And in doing so, he didn't just start a war. He unleashed a movement that thousands believed would decide not just the fate of a city, but the fate of their souls. Europe wasn't peaceful before the Crusades. It was overflowing with warriors who had nowhere to go. And that was the real problem. By the late 11th century, Western Europe was a violent, fragmented world. Nobles fought each other constantly, and war was a way of life. But something had changed. There were now too many knights and not enough land. Under the feudal system, only the eldest son inherited everything. The rest? They were trained to fight, but had nothing to fight for. No land, no title, no future. And so, they turned their swords on each other. Small wars broke out everywhere. Villages burned. Power shifted constantly. The church tried to control this violence, but it couldn't stop it. Because this wasn't just chaos, it was pressure building up. And it wasn't only the knights. For peasants, life was harsh and uncertain. Famine, hardship, and fear were part of everyday life. But they believed something deeply, that their suffering had meaning, and that salvation was possible. So when the idea of crusade appeared, it didn't feel like war. It felt like opportunity. For knights, it meant land, wealth, and glory. A chance to carve out a future that Europe denied them. For nobles, it meant expansion, influence, power. For peasants, it meant redemption, a way to escape hardship and secure their soul. And for all of them, it offered something they didn't have before, a single direction, a single purpose. So when the call finally came, Europe didn't hesitate, because the crusade wasn't just a holy war. It was an answer to a society that had been waiting for something to release its pressure. When Pope Urban II called for the crusade, he thought he knew exactly what he was creating. But he didn't, because what followed was something no one could control. At first, Urban's vision was clear. He didn't call for peasants. He didn't call for chaos. He wanted trained knights, organized armies, led by nobles who could fight a real war. A controlled campaign, a calculated mission. But that's not what people heard. They didn't hear strategy. They heard salvation, forgiveness of sins, a path to heaven, a chance to change their fate. And that changed everything. Because the message didn't stay within the nobility. It spread from castles to villages, from knights to farmers, from the elite to the masses. And suddenly, it was no longer a military campaign. It became a movement. Tens of thousands answered the call. Many had no training, no supplies, no understanding of what lay ahead. They just believed, and some couldn't even wait. Men like Peter the Hermit began preaching across the countryside. His words ignited something raw, emotional, urgent, unstoppable. And before the real crusade had even begun, they were already marching. This was the People's Crusade, a wave of peasants, pilgrims, and untrained fighters, moving east with faith, but without preparation. It was chaotic, uncoordinated, and dangerously fragile. What Urban had intended as a controlled war had become a force far beyond his reach. Because once belief turns into movement, it no longer asks for permission, and the crusade had already begun.